Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. King, thank you for joining us for a second day. I want to build on Mr. Bishop's line of questioning. I want to ask you about your experience as the Commissioner of Education in our home state of New York. And as you can imagine, and I'm sure you're very familiar with, I hear lots of concerned questions and comments from students, from teachers, from parents about the rushed and fundamentally flawed implementation of Common Core in New York State. And to me, the feedback that I hear is that across party lines, there's frustration with teacher evaluations, with high-stakes testing, and sky-high opt-out rates. In my district, for example, opt-out rates are some of the highest in the state, with schools in Franklin and Herkimer counties reporting opt-out rates in the high 80s. So my question for you today is, what lessons did you learn from the fundamentally flawed implementation and the rushed implementation in New York State, and do you think mistakes were made?
Well, we have to go back to, as states have moved over the last few years towards higher standards, what was the reason, what was the rationale? And what we know, whether it's New York or all across the country, too many of the students who graduate from high school graduate underprepared for what's next. As you know, on the SUNY campuses, SUNY is spending millions of dollars on remedial courses. In the highest needs communities in SUNY and CUNY, the state university system in the 90% of entering students are required to take remedial classes, essentially high school classes, for which they and their families pay college prices. And so the challenge is, how do you ensure that the system is pointed towards high standards that will allow students to graduate ready for success? And that is a hard process, and it requires consistent stakeholder engagement.
Do you think you adequately got feedback from consistently from stakeholders? One of the concerns that I hear from teachers is that they felt they were not adequately a part of the process and the discussion.
In New York, as in many states, teachers were very actively engaged in the process of developing standards and also adjusting standards, and that process continues. And I think we will always expect that states will constantly seek feedback from teachers and principals as they adjust their standards. I do think in New York and around the country, one of the challenges is that the implementation of higher standards has come alongside changes in teacher evaluation. And it is fair to say, and this is true again across the country, in many places those contentious discussions about teacher evaluation got conflated with the issues around higher standards. I think this new law gives us an opportunity for a reset on those conversations around teacher evaluation in particular. And there's an opportunity for states to look at how do they ensure that their evaluation systems are actually providing support to educators. How do we ensure that they don't feel like a gotcha system, but rather feel like a source of support? And how do states ensure that they're leveraging, whether it's Title I or Title II dollars, to support teachers around implementing higher standards, again, with a willingness to adjust that effort as time goes along.
So just to go back to my initial question, you wouldn't have done anything differently. Do you believe there were any mistakes made in the flawed rollout of Common Core in New York State?
Again, as in New York, as in the rest of the country, I think we've learned a lot about the change process over the last few years. There were, I think, in many states, an unfortunate phenomenon. There was an unfortunate phenomenon of the teacher evaluation work and the work of raising standards being conflated together, and I think that generated, both while I was there and after I left, generated its own sets of tension.
So as Commissioner, when you served as Commissioner of New York State, what would you have done differently? I consistently hear from teachers, parents, and students about the rushed implementation, that their viewpoints weren't integrated. I know you're acting Secretary of Education and were nominated to be Secretary of Education. I think it's really important to see if you think there were any mistakes made when you served as Commissioner of New York State.
And it's more a question of what we learn over time, again, not just in New York, but across the country. And I think part of what we're seeing with the Testing Action Plan, we did something similar in New York, grants to school districts, to bring together educators to look at the assessments they were giving, evaluate which ones are useful and which aren't, and which could be reduced. That was a good step. I think we in New York and folks across the country, as they look at that, wish we'd done that sooner. I think there's the conversation that will be unleashed by the Every Student Succeeds Act about how we broaden the definition of educational excellence, I think creates an opportunity. I don't think anyone intended for science and social studies or art and music to get less attention when No Child Left Behind was adopted, but the reality is in many places they did. We now have an opportunity with a new law to relook at that and for states to think more broadly about how they define educational excellence.
The gentlelady's time, I'm sorry, has
Thank you.
expired.